Increased petroleum use has direct and indirect implications for the total energy consumption and socio-economic growth potential of a country. In that sense, affordability and environmental preservation remain a challenge. Good evening, I'm Jonas Mbambo. Welcome back. Tonight, Geoenergy focuses on the fuel price review process and is set to give us a better understanding of the regulation of fuel prices in the country. The Minister of Mines and Energy, Tom Alwendo, is joining me to explain how the government maintains fair and reasonable national prices for petroleum products. He is also here to explain how the regulations affect the oil sector. Hey, good evening to you, Honorable Minister, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jonas, and good evening to all the listeners there.
Let's perhaps start with the source of our petroleum and petroleum products. Where do we exactly get it from?
We of course, as we all know, that we do not refine petrol or refine diesel. So everything we consume, we actually import it somewhere else. There are typically 2 or 3 areas where people will import, those who do import fuel. Either you get it from the Gulf area, or you get it from Singapore, or you got it from the Mediterranean areas. So those are typically the 3 areas where importing countries import their fuel from. And you probably the question is why those areas?
Yes.
It's only because most of the refineries are found in those areas. Wherever crude oil is found, typically it goes to the refineries in the Mediterranean or in the Gulf area or in Singapore. And from there on, obviously, then refined products are now sold to the importing countries.
How cumbersome of a process is it, to get these petroleum products to Namibia?
It is not really very cumbersome, and I should probably also make it clear, because when people talk about us importing the oil or the fuel, people somehow assume that it's the government that imports the fuel. I had to make it clear that it's not actually the government that imports the oil. The oil is imported by the wholesale oil companies. I think we did talk about this earlier, like, you got Puma, you got the Geoenergy, you got the BP. Those are the companies that import those oil. But it's not really complex, because if you have been doing this, of course, it's a business practice. You have established your customers, you know exactly where you're going to buy it, you know exactly the process, to be followed. So it's not really very complex issues. Any complex than importing any other product into the country. So it's not really that complex.
Up north, just right above Namibia, we have Angola, which is also one of the largest oil producers in the world. And one would perhaps ask, if you look at it geographically, so one would think, well, logically, it would make sense for us to get some of this petroleum from Angola. Is there a reason why we don't do that?
Yeah. A couple of things. This question has been re-asked a lot, to say, well, petrol is cheap in Angola. Diesel is cheap in Angola. And that is why we even have a situation where actually people are actually illegally importing fuel from Angola on the basis that it is cheaper. And people now say, well, if it's that cheap, why not just import it from Angola? There are 2 things. Fuel price is an international determined price. It's not true that just because Angola has got cheap price, if you were to buy from Angola, it's going to be cheap. Angola will probably sell their refined product to us at the very same price that we'll buy from anywhere else. So it's not the case that we can simply go and get cheap price from Angola. And the thing why also the fuel is cheap in Angola, it is heavily subsidized by the Angolan government, and therefore they will not sell to us a subsidized price. They will sell to us the real price at which they actually buy the product from. And mind you, Angola, although they are oil producing countries, they got crude. it has to be understood that right now Angola refined less than 10% of their need of the country. So it's not like they have got refined products from their own crude oil. They are still importing at least 90% of their needs. And if you ask me, where do they import it? They import it exactly from where we import the fuel. At what cost? At the very same cost that we are importing it, because the price is internationally determined, and therefore it's not true that suddenly we can get cheap fuel from Angola. There's also another thing. Within the SADC protocol, to try and manage the carbon, we signed up to this COP21 to manage the environment. Now, within the SADC area, we have got the protocol there where we have agreed to say at certain dates we need to only import or use fuel refined to a certain standard. Whether it's diesel or whether it's petrol, there's an agreement to say at a certain date only fuel at this standard can be imported. And the idea is actually to have less and less acid in the product. And therefore, one of the reasons why we can also then import the oil from Angola, the ones they refine themselves, are actually up not to that standard that has been determined, and therefore that's one of the reasons why it doesn't happen. But I think the real main reason is just to say it's not true that we suddenly can import fuel from Angola cheap, simply because it's cheaper in Angola, because as I said, they don't refine all their products. They buy from the same source where we buy from at the very same price, and there's no way they're going to sell it to us at any cheaper price.
Let's say if, for example, after a few years, Angola has the ability and the capacity to refine their crude oil to the standard that we accept. Do we see future imports coming from that side?
I think it's something we should work towards. I mean, on the African continent, it's not only Angola, the other countries also who are producing oil. And therefore, if we can all make concerted efforts, both the consuming countries and the producing country, if you can really have a continental effort to say, well, let's invest in the refineries on the continent. Even if the importing country can also be, party to the investment, that obviously it will be much easier to buy then the refined product from the continent. I mean, that's something I think we should all actually want to do that, get the investment, refine the product, and sell to the African countries. It will be much cheaper logistically. You don't have to have a ship load coming all the way from the Gulf area, from Singapore. You could have a ship sailing from Angola, Luanda port to Walvis Bay port. From Luanda going to DRC. Yeah. It will be much easier, and therefore that is really something I think as a continent we should really strive to invest more in the refineries, so that at least we can then buy the final products from the continent.
Talk to us about the process that the ministry follows to adjust the monthly fuel prices, and why does the government control the prices of petrol and diesel in the country?
Yeah, in the first place, diesel, petrol or fuel, it's really a product that is needed in the development of the countries. It's very, very crucial to make sure that you got a sustainable pricing mechanism for this product, because it's so crucial for a lot of things to happen in the country. And because of the nature of the fluctuating nature of the price, you don't want to have a price that is going up and down all the time and making it difficult for people to plan for their businesses. And that is one of the reasons why the government then decided to say it will be a controlled price. It cannot be sold at whatever price the importing companies who want to sell. Just to make it like it's very smooth and orderly, so that you do not disrupt businesses. The whole thing, as I said, the fuel is imported by company, not by the government. And because it's controlled, you can also then control to the extent that you ask people to sell the fuel at a price less than at the cost which they bought. So you control the price, but it's still to make it possible for people to be able to still to do business with that product, because they also buying from somewhere else. So the whole idea is to say there must be cost recovery. If a company is importing this fuel, they are paying for it. There's a cost involved. Whatever price then you are going to determine to be the price at which they are going to be selling that, it must take into account the fact that this is a business, and therefore there must be a profit margin also built into that. Now, what we do on a monthly basis, because typically companies have probably a monthly importation of this product. What we then make sure then to say, we want to determine a price that is really closer to what is really the cost involved in importing the price. And therefore, just a week before the month ends, we do a review. We look at projecting what the price might be, for the next month, for example. We look at what the exchange rate is likely to behave, because this is price into US dollars. We look at the insurance cost, because when you bring in, not only do you buy the fuel itself, but you also had to add your the insurance cost, your freight cost, and everything else. So we then look at all those elements, and then determine that should be the price for the following months. Now, the nature of things, obviously, as I say now, when it comes to exchange rate, for example, it may not exactly turn out exactly the way it was. And that's why at times there will always be a discrepancy. Either there was an under-recovery or an over-recovery based on what has happened the last few days before you determine that price. So we really just make sure that the price is set in such a way that the companies are able to recoup their cost of the importation of the oil and still be able to do the business.
Why is it that the fuel prices differ from town to town across the country?
Yeah. As I said now, of course, the only importation station into the country is Walvis Bay.
Yes.
Now, you then know that now the landed price at Walvis Bay, as I say, the price that, the cost of the fuel itself, the insurance, the freight, the port charges, that determine the price at Walvis Bay. And then from there on now, you need to transport the fuel throughout the country.
Yes.
Now, it will then mean that, that cost of transportation will be added to the price, the eventual price at the pump price. And therefore, the furthest town from Walvis Bay obviously will attract a much higher price because of the added transportation costs from Walvis Bay to, say, if you're in Katima Mulilo, for example. That will be much more expensive petrol than what you'll buy, for example, in Chuarango or in Windhoek. But we also recognize the fact that, unfortunately, the furthest towns, especially some of the rural towns, far away from Walvis Bay, you find that they are also probably not really in the position to also then, absorb this high cost. And that's also why within the pricing mechanism, we also have built into what we call a transport subsidy, whereby we collect a few cents, which will then subsidize the price, for example, what we would charge in Katima Mulilo, just to make it a little bit more comparable to the prices within the inland prices, and not to make the consumer in Katima Mulilo to pay that high price simply because of the distance. So at least we subsidize that because of the long distance.
So that's where the government chips in.
Yeah, the government, through the NEF, there's a levy that is collected that will subsidize the cost of transportation to some of the most rural areas.
Now that's one of the roles of the NEF. What other roles does the NEF play, the National Energy Fund?
Yeah. As I said, when we determine the price, for the following year, month. When we look into all the elements of the cost element, the fuel price itself, the transportation and the exchange rate. And as I said, we determine that normally not on the last day of the month. It's a few days before the month. Now, in that month, it may turn out then that we determined a price that is a little much lower than really what the whole month price was when the people imported the fuel. And therefore, there will be a discrepancy between the price we determined and the cost structure when people imported this oil. That discrepancy is what we call this under recovery. At the pump price, because that pump price normally is not what basically it will then be going to be through the system paying the importers. So at that pump price then, the price will be a little much lower than the cost structure of importing. Therefore, there will be that under recovery. So what then the NEF does then is to say, if let's say there was an under recovery of which is maybe too high, let's say it's $1 or something, we might then say, well, naturally we want them to pass that under recovery to the consumer because you actually bought cheaper than what you should have, or you bought cheaper than what you should have done it. So we may then say, okay, well, although the difference is $1, we'll probably only pass on the increase in fuel, say of 70 cents. And the 30 cents will then be recovered from the NEF. And therefore the NEF will then compensate, that 30 cents will compensate the importing oil companies. Just to make sure that it is you don't always pass through the increase if it's too high, if the under recovery was too high. The opposite also happens. There are sometimes when you determine the price, it may turn out that actually the price was a little higher than what the cost was, and therefore there will be over recovery. In that case, then the importing oil companies will owe some money into the NEF, and therefore, in the long run, there's an equalization within the NEF, just to make sure that there's a smooth pricing mechanism.
For this next question, I would like us to use our imagination for a bit. We have that Dangeni, let's say, who's in Oshakati watching the news, and the international slot comes on, and the news breaks that Iran and the United States, for example, are at odds. The United States decides to impose sanctions on Iran. And the next day, the Dangeni wakes up to news that the fuel price might increase. How are these two things connected? I mean, the Dangeni is in Oshakati, and there's this war between Washington and Tehran. How is it affecting the money that I'm paying for the fuel that's going into my car?
So it's a very good question. The oil industry, it's a bit complicated. You would understand, or you recall, for example, that within the oil-producing countries, they got their own club, what they call the OPEC.
OPEC, yes.
Oil and petroleum, exporting countries. These are the guys who determine how much production is going to be. And of course, you got the members, the likes of Nigeria is a member that is from the continent. You got of course, the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and all those guys. They determine how much output would they actually take to the market in terms of crude oil. And that will then have an impact on the demand and supply of the product. Because eventually the price is always determined because of the demand. If you got too much oil on the market, obviously the price will go down because there's just enough to buy. If you got too little, then of course the price will go up. So this oil-producing country, they can really determine in terms of what price it will be. When they think the price is too low, they simply just withdraw the production. And when they think it's too high, then of course they either they withdraw or they increase the production. Now that being the case, obviously now geopolitics comes into the equation. Certain things, for example, there was a sanction against Iran, one of the producing countries, Now, if suddenly the production that comes from Iran is no longer part of the total production, what happens? Chances are that the price is going to go up because now you have reduced the output. So yes, Tanganyika and Shakati will certainly be influenced by that geopolitics simply because the market is one market, it's a global market, and therefore, because of now the high price of crude oil, and the refinery companies that buy this crude oil will probably now buy it more expensive, and suddenly at the pump price, by the time we also buy it, that will be actually increase the pump price.
Right.
So it's very, it's true that, you know, it's not really something one country can control to say, well, this is the price. And that's why I'm saying the price is not really determined so much by the government. The government simply says, okay, this is what the cost is, and therefore the price should be based on this basis.
So Minister will be right back after this break. You're watching Geoenergy. When we come back, we'll look at the impact of COVID-19 on fuel prices in Namibia. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Geoenergy, and tonight we are focusing on fuel prices in the country. Honorable Minister, COVID-19 has obviously taken a very heavy toll across the world, across all industries. But if you look at the fuel industry, the oil industry, how has it affected us in this country?
You know, when the pandemic broke out, there were two concerns. Number one, we're not quite sure how the transportations of the product will be affected. How will be the shipping lines? Will there be like a shutdown where, you know, people can no longer actually transport these things? And that's one of the first things we were concerned about. The other thing, of course, we knew was that the fact that there's going to be less demand for the product. Because if certain industries are no longer going to be able to, you know, they are not producing at the capacity which they normally used to, and therefore demanding the fuel at the same level, there was going to be, of course, a concern. On the first one, with the disruption of the distribution and logistics, fortunately, that did not happen. Yeah. I think the ship lining company, they continue to deliver their fuel wherever it was needed. So that at least, no, it was not really borne out as a risk. With regard to the second issue of the demand, obviously, the demand after March and going into April, May, June, we noted that the demand for fuel was really very low. Because suddenly there was a time, for example, our mining companies were not operating at the full capacity. Because of the social distancing, they could not get every worker on the mine, and therefore they used less fuel. And also in other sectors, the tourism sector, that was heavily, impacted. You always have people who are hiring cars and traveling all over the countries. Suddenly, that's only 10% of that, and therefore there was a reduction in the demand. And that also then make it difficult for some of the oil companies, especially at the retail level, to continue to be able to operate with a low demand, especially if you still need to keep your employees going, and therefore if you used to sell 20,000 liters a month, now you're only selling 5,000 liters a month. So it became a little bit difficult on the demand side, yes.
I know you do not have a crystal ball, you're not a fortune teller, but what do you think the future holds, going forward? We don't know when this COVID-19 pandemic is really going to end, or when we're going to be able to have full control over it. But how do you see us doing business differently in the fuel industry?
Yeah. I think for us now, really within the fuel industry, we cannot really say that the pandemic is as bad as it is in other sectors. The volume, the demand actually is way back to what it was in, like for example, in February or March. So I think from that perspective, the industry is not really worse off as other industries, as I said. But still, if the other industries continue not to be able to operate at the full capacity, there will still be that lingering concern about the oil sector as well. So depending again, as you know, this is a global pandemic. We somehow have been seeing, in our country at least, locally, we have seen the numbers of infection rate coming down, but nobody really knows what's going to happen. I mean, we have seen other countries where the rates came down, but suddenly there was another round of, where the infection rate was actually, spiking up. So we don't know, in our case, what's going to happen, and therefore, even with now the fact that, the rates are coming down, we should still continue to be cautious, not to say, oh, COVID-19 is over and therefore. So as long as really, the global pandemic continues, will somehow affect it, because as I said, it's not always sometimes because of what's happening with Namibia. Even with, let's say, today we have no cases at all of COVID-19. The fact that the Europeans still have got those cases, or the Americans have got those cases, or maybe the Chinese have the cases, the fact that you need to do business with them, and therefore they cannot do business with you because of that, of course, will still be impacted. So one is just hoping that, globally things will get better. And where we are at, of course, every country now starting to say we must just learn how to live with this.
Yes.
But for now, at least, the oil industry is not really that heavily impacted. It shows you that actually, the impression somehow people think, during the year there was a lot of increases, but actually there were a lot of decreases. And that is understandable because simply the demand of the fuel was really not at the same level, and therefore even international prices was a little bit depressed, and therefore there was really no increase. There were more on average decrease in the prices. The 50 cent you were talking about, in April, May, as I was saying, because of the low demand, a lot of oil companies have approached us to say, look, because of this low demand and because of the fact that we do not really want to lay off staff members, is it possible for the government to actually give us some relief in terms of adding to our profit margin? Because in the pricing of the fuel, there's always a margin that is priced in, and I think the margin right now at retail level is like $1.10. Now they were saying, for us to be able at least to keep the level of our employees, can we get at least a relief or something? And what we did then to say, okay, well, we'll add a 50 cent on your profit margin for a 3-month period, just to help you to adjust to what we now call the new normal, such that you do not have to lay off people, and hopefully up to a point where the demand would have gone back to where it was. And by the time we then remove that after 3 months, yes, I think by then the demand was more or less at the level where they were before. So at least that did in a way help the retailers to be able to adjust.
In some countries, in most cases, more developed countries than Namibia, we've seen people taking to the streets and protest against, in some instances, the increase in fuel prices. That hasn't happened in Namibia yet. Does that suggest that the money that we pay for fuel is reasonable, or is it just a thing of, well, my car must run and I have no choice, I just have to fuel up anyways. Yeah. Whether they increase it by $1 or $2 or 50 cents, I have no choice. Yeah. What do you think?
But when you say it hasn't happened yet, you're kind of suggesting that it might happen. Is that? Yeah. I think it's as I said, fuel is a very important commodity in any economy. And it's felt in everybody's pocket. And that is why you need to have an orderly price mechanism to make sure at least that even if there's an increase, it's not a sudden increase. It's not like, from low to high, and therefore people are really struggling. So I think if we continue to manage the price, the way we have been managing, and also just explain to the people what it is. To say, yes, this is what the price is, that's how it's determined. It's really based on the cost where we are buying the product. It's not that somehow the government simply want to set a price and overcharge the consumers. And therefore for me, the most important part of this is really just to make the consumer understand exactly how it works. And to have an appreciation when there is a price increase or there's a price decrease, is because this has happened. And I think that will help. If you keep people in the dark not knowing, I only hear there's a price increase, I don't know why. Suddenly I think, oh, maybe it's just because, you know, the government want to do certain things and therefore why they're increasing the price. But it's really just because this is what happened internationally, and this is the cost we have to pay, unfortunately. So that's what we want to continue to. But I also know that in some of those countries, certainly, I think it's the way, probably the way it happens. I know that, for example, countries where the price was heavily subsidized. And people really believe that that's what the price cost. But suddenly the government realized we cannot continue to subsidize to this extent. Now, for you to remove a subsidy, it's always difficult. It's really difficult to remove a subsidy, especially if you do not really, all along, I didn't know that I was being subsidized. Yeah. I really thought I was paying the real price. But suddenly you tell me, no, actually, you were paying less than what the price, it's just that I didn't tell you because I was subsidizing it.
Well, whose fault is that?
Well, that's why I'm saying the communication is very important to say, what price are you paying and how was this price determined? That's very important.
And do you think that the ministry, the government as a whole is doing a good job in informing people about these things?
I think that's for you to judge. We're trying because usually we will issue, every month we issue a press release actually explaining in detail why this change or why there's no change. And also, especially when there's a big change, which we have to communicate. Not only do we just use the press release, but actually we call a press conference to explain exactly why suddenly there's this change. And that's what we want to continue to do, just to really make sure that people really understand what it is. And it's not always to say because I've explained that you would necessarily be happy or would do, but at least you will understand exactly what went into my decision to say now there's going to be this change.
All right, we'll be right back after this break. Stick around. Welcome back. If you're just tuning in, you're watching Geoenergy with me, Jonas Mbambo, joined by the Minister of Mines and Energy, Tom Alwendo. Honourable Minister, you mentioned that most of the information regarding fuel price increases is put out through press statements or press conferences. But the biggest problem that I think, you know, not only myself but many other people have is that these things are usually published in English. And if you look at the terminology, it's very technical, and I really just want to understand what exactly does it mean for me, and what is being done for the everyday person that is at home, that doesn't listen to the English radio stations, for example, but the indigenous radio stations. How does the ministry ensure that this information trickles down to the very people that are affected by these things?
As I have said, on a monthly basis, we do issue these press releases, and it's true, they are in English. And when I say communication is very good, it's a very good vehicle for people to understand and have an appreciation of how things are working. I would agree to say it would probably need to also extend the way we communicate, not only in English, and also maybe not only the platforms that we are using now, which is normally it's either televisions or we put a press release on our website, you know. So to go probably more in using probably like the radios in the local languages, that I think most people in the rural area, for example, will really you know, appreciate, and that's what they normally have access to. So we right now we don't do that, but I would agree that this is something we should probably really start to do, to also then explain to the people, given the importance of the information, so that as many people understand this.
Some people might not have understood the increase of fuel prices during the time of COVID-19, when reports indicated that crude oil prices were particularly low. Talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, I recall there was a time when the crude oil went really, really down. I think it was, at some point, it was even like $10, even lower than the $10 a barrel. And there was now, in fact, there was a call to say, well, now that the oil is very cheap, why can't we actually buy as much and store it, and so that at least we got some, something cheap. But unfortunately, the price that was that low, it was not the price of petrol or diesel. It was the price of crude oil. And there's no way to buy crude oil and store it, because you can only do that if you got the refinery. Because now, obviously, if you're the refinery, you'll buy cheap, and therefore then hopefully then have a cheaper crude, and therefore hopefully then to sell it at the cheaper, the refined product at a cheaper price. But I also know it didn't happen that way. The guys who own the refinery, yes, they might have bought that crude oil, but because for them they're also about not disrupting the market, they simply continue to sell the refined product exactly the same price they used to sell. So it did have a bit of an impact, but not the impact on the refined product was not as large as the impact on the crude itself. Because the guys who deal with the crude are not the same guy who deal with it's a different industry, so to say. So it was not really practical for us to say, let's buy the crude. And even if we could have done that, unfortunately, the international fuel price of the refined product has not really moved that substantially. But it did move. That's why I was saying there was the time when we had, for 3 months, there was a reduction simply because the international price came down a little bit, but not to the same extent as the crude oil.
Yeah. So for those 3 months, that was the only silver lining.
Yep.
That
because of the crude oil reduction in the price, there was also a small reduction in the international price of the refined products, which also we could then also pass on to the consumers.
So in actual fact, when people talk about crude oil for a country that imports all its its oil products, there isn't really any cause for celebration unless, of course, you have a refinery. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if you have a refinery and then you're buying this product, which is now cheap, which is now the input into your production for refined product, yes, the country could probably be happy a bit. But as I said again, you can't be too happy, because this is a very international pricing mechanism, and people are too even if the price could go down by 50%. That will disrupt the market, and they will probably not really reduce the price to that extent, because they don't want the price that go up like this. They still want to have, even if there's a reduction, there must be a smooth reduction, or if there's an increase, there must be also a smooth increase. So when things are really internationally market determined, individual countries don't really have much of big influence on what happened. Yeah. But obviously, if we got a persistent low price in crude oil, it will show up in the final product.
The petroleum supplies market in the SADC region has undergone a significant transformation. How would you say this has affected Namibia, and what exactly is this transformation that we are talking about?
When people talk about the transformation in the region, I'm not quite always sure what they're talking about. If we are talking about the fact that, I earlier talked about the fact that we are strict in terms of the standard of the fuel, so that we do not really accept fuel that is not refined to a standard that we think will help us to manage the environment. That's probably one of the transformations that happened. But other than that, really, nothing really has changed much. For example, the way the pricing mechanism that I have explained It's still the same mechanism we use, and it's mostly used in all the SADC countries. So nothing really have much. What would probably have the transformation I'll probably want to see is when within the SADC region, and also maybe not only in the SADC region, as I was saying earlier, on the continent, when you really start saying, we've got enough crude oil that can be refined and transform the whole industry by refining that ourselves. Mm-hmm. That will probably one of the really important transformation that can come about within the industry. Mm.
Lastly, every time I read or hear the news that we might have a decrease in the prices of diesel or petrol, I smile because I know I get to save $1 or $2.
Okay, that's what I was trying to say. Well, it doesn't happen that the Minister of Mines and Energy simply wakes up today and say, "Oh, I want to give a gift to people." We are about to review, to do our monthly review again. And as I said, it will really just the change, if there any change, will still again just determined by the cost structure of the product. If we find that there is good reason, either the international cost has come down or the exchange rate has strengthened, for example, there's an appreciation of the exchange rate. It has been a bit stable, it hasn't really been too much depreciation. If we then to find that there actually is a room for us to be able to reduce, that might happen. But equally can also turn out the other way around to say the cost looks as if that there's a need for an increase. But really the result will always be based on what we found when we were looking at all these factors.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your time.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. And with that said, we've come to the end of yet another edition of Geoenergy, where the focus was on a fuel price review process. And if you have any questions or want to find out more about how you can get involved, you can contact the Public Relations Officer at the Ministry at info@mme.gov.na. Alternatively, check out their Facebook page under the name Ministry of Mines and Energy, or visit their website at www.mme.gov.na. With that said, we've come to the end of the show. Till next time, cheers for now.